Welcome to Money Secrets with Bill and Mike.
I'm Bill Alexander.
And I'm Mike Tove. Bill, you know, this is some challenging economic times we're entering, isn't it?
It really is. It's been tough for a lot of families, but it's also changing times.
Right. And so I figured our folks would want to know a little bit more about that. And so I have reached out to a faculty member at NC State.
Yes, we're just so lucky to have Mike Walden with us today, an economic professor of great merit who's written a number of publications that I hope he will tell us about.
Right.
And we're just fortunate to have him with us today.
So we'll be right back and we'll talk to him. And we're back. So, Bill, let's introduce our guest, Dr. Walden from NC State. You've been in State, what, 40 years?
Going on 40 years. Came in 1978. In fact, as we're sitting here, it was 39 years ago I came for my interview. I got my PhD at Cornell, came here from snowy Cornell and Ithaca to, I think it was weather very similar to what we're experiencing now, is in the 70-degree range. And like the program, like the people, my future wife was that we weren't married yet, but she was nearby, so that worked into the decision. And who knew I would be here almost 40 years later?
North Carolina's a great state. Once you're here, it's hard to leave.
It is very much hard to leave, yes.
But as I was saying in the opening, we're entering some economic new territory, I think, maybe. Isn't that correct?
Well, economists like to say every year is challenging. That's probably one reason why people keep us around and people like you like to talk to us. But yes, I think clearly the Trump administration, their economic policies, I mean, President Trump literally ran on a platform of economic revival, changing a lot of things, shaking up a lot of things, tax code, trade, et cetera. So we are very much watching what the administration will propose to Congress in the tax area and the regulatory area and the trade area. And I mean, one thing I think you can say about Donald Trump, he looks like he's got a lot of energy, whether you like him or not. So I think we'll have a lot of proposals out there for the Congress to consider, which could shake up a lot of things. I mean, clearly for investing, the tax code is important, and we think he's going to make some major proposals in the tax area.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, if obviously it requires Congress to actually put together a proposal and then the president to approve it, but presumptive that something along those lines happens, what are we looking at?
Well, I think we're looking at lowering tax rates, all of the tax rates that apply to the different brackets, and I think your listeners probably understand that when you file your taxes and you're figuring out your federal income tax, everything's not taxed at the same rate. Things are sliced in the brackets. He wants to lower all of those numbers so the tax rates will be lower, which incidentally would affect one investment that would affect would be the benefit of municipal bonds, because you don't pay federal taxes on that. So if you're not saving as much in the tax area, that might not make those as lucrative and probably cause issues of those municipal bonds to raise the rate. So he's talking about that. He's talking potentially, we don't have as much information here, about changing some of the deductions. His Treasury Secretary, now confirmed Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, talked, for example, in response to a question about won't high-income people mainly benefit from these lower tax rates? And he said, oh, you're not taking into account the fact we're going to really shake up deductions, and they're not going to get the deductions. So there's a lot of uncertainty there.
Shaking up deductions can affect middle-class taxpayers in a big way, too.
Yeah.
I know that there are probably some folks out there that were hoping that Trump would go to an absolute flat tax. But that's not really what he's proposed. But he has talked about compressing the different tax rates into 3 tax rates. And actually, the lowest tax rate, he's talking about increasing from 10% to 12%, and then to go to 25% and 33%. And of course, 33% is a 6.9% reduction in the highest tax rate. But of course, only folks earning in the neighborhood of $400,000 a year are up at that tax rate.
And of course, one issue here, which has been debated for over 30 years, is whether cuts in tax rates generate so much additional growth that they will pay for themselves. Economic research questions that. We maybe recover a third of the tax reduction. So I think on the face of it, we would be looking at an increase in federal borrowing from that part of the Trump plan if, for example, President Trump has a big infrastructure program that he's talked about, $1 trillion, that may imply further federal borrowing. So I think we're probably looking at additional pressure on long-term interest rates, especially due to the federal government moving into the borrowing area more.
That's an area of concern for me, is that if presumably these tax changes should be net revenue neutral, but I'm suspicious they won't be.
Right.
But if the net revenues in is reduced, but the spending goes up,
Right.
then that puts us in
Yeah.
a
I think that would
bucket
be
of hot
safe.
water.
I think safe to say that the deficit and the debt, which is the accumulation of deficits, will go up. Now, very interestingly, we're going to have the first budget of the Trump administration put out within a couple months. And President Trump has not appointed any members of his Council of Economic Advisors. In fact, to my knowledge, he has one PhD economist on his staff, a guy named Peter Navarro, who's in a new position called the National Trade Policy Administration. And we're thinking that the Trump administration didn't hire some professional economists because they don't want them to perhaps say, Mr. President, these proposals aren't going to increase growth as you think they will. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see when the budget's released what kind of assumptions the Trump administration implies in terms of economic growth. One of the things that the president campaigned on was increasing economic growth from roughly the 2% it's been for almost 2 decades to 4%. And it's going to be interesting to see if he assumes that's going to happen in his budget.
Well, I've always thought empirically that if you put more money in the hands of folks who have less money, that tends to give you better growth because they have to spend it, or
Right.
they do spend it.
Right.
And that helps all businesses. But when you're talking about folks who have a lot of money and they don't necessarily spend it, they might invest it, but they don't go out and buy things with it.
Yeah. In my mind, probably the area that should get the most focus is what the Trump administration will mean in terms of regulations. There's actually some new research published in part by economists at Duke that suggests that the regulations that have been added at the federal level have had a big adverse impact on economic growth. That
Okay.
if we changed all the regulations that have been added since 1980 at the federal level, we could boost annual economic growth by almost 1%. That's big.
Wow,
So I
that's
think
huge.
that's going to be a big issue. But of course, regulations are put in part to have benefits. So we have to balance those benefits against perhaps benefits that were lost if those regulations are gone.
Well, let's take a little break and then we'll come back, and I want to spend a little bit more time on that and then talk about how is this going to impact the average person. We'll be right back. And we're back. So this is a fascinating conversation, but I want to know, what is this going to mean for the average person in the street? I mean, you know, it's easy for us to sit here and talk about the theory of economics, and at the end of the day, if it doesn't impact the dollar bills that I have in my pocket, it's kind of like over the top, over my head.
Well, investing has a couple of components. Obviously, one is choosing the particular investments, which takes some analysis of what companies are going to do well and what others aren't, making some forecasts of that. But over top of all of that is the macroeconomy. I mean, all businesses operate within the macroeconomy. And so here we're looking this year at potentially some major changes in the macroeconomy. If, for example, the Trump proposals get through and they're growth enhancing, and the stock market, I think, is already anticipating that, that could mean that the level of growth will be better, which would be a positive pretty much for all companies. Now, there could be some trade-offs there. One downside, or two downsides, as I say, that most economists are expecting is probably higher interest rates, which for investors who want safe investments might be a good thing. But if you're a borrower, particularly on a home mortgage, we've already seen those rates go up by about 0.5 percentage points. But higher interest rate and slightly higher inflation. In fact, the last inflation report we got had inflation running at a 2.5% annual rate. So I think those two things could be potential downsides. But again, we're going to have to wait and see what the Trump proposals specifically are. To what extent does Congress shift them and change them? For example, if the home mortgage deduction were proposed to be scaled down, you know Congress. There are going to be interest groups going to go to Congress and battle that. So we're all anticipating now. And one concern I have, the stock market has gone up so fast in anticipation of these growth-enhancing policies. If they don't happen, I think we could see a sell-off.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I'm always worried about in this regard is people will say to me, well, what about hyperinflation? Yeah, that's just around the corner, and I've been hearing that hyperinflation is around the corner for years.
Right.
But I don't know that that's the case.
I think that's not going to happen. It is true that the Federal Reserve, and of course we always have to, the Federal Reserve is this massively important institution that's most people know is out there. They don't understand how it's run. As an sidebar, I should say that 3 of the Board of Governors, that's the board that manages the Federal Reserve, 3 of those seats are vacant. So President Trump is going to have an immediate possibility of impacting that. Now, Chair Yellen has another term on her position as chair. But the Federal Reserve did move very, very aggressively during the Great Recession. In my opinion, that was needed. One of the things they did do is create a lot of money to simplify. But most of that money they created is parked at the Federal Reserve as a backstop to the bank. So we're not looking, at least I haven't seen any forecasts that suggest hyperinflation, but I do think we're going to edge from maybe under 2% a year to maybe the mid 2%. But when I came to NC State in '78, we had 13% inflation.
I remember those
and
days.
we had 17% mortgage rate. So
Well.
I'm not looking for anything like that, but slightly higher inflation in the next few
2%
years.
does not sound like hyperinflation to
No.
me,
Yeah.
and that's good. But I want to go back to something that you just said that I think is really important for our audience, and that is a risk, and that is to watch for whether these Trump initiatives are actually passed. And of course, most folks think they will be because there is a fairly cooperative Congress at this point. But the bottom line is, if the Trump initiatives do not go through the way investors think,
Right.
a potential sell-off in the market. You know, we've lived through a couple of those just in the last decade, so I think that's something that people really need to be cautious of, the greater risk in the market.
Right. Right.
Well, the thing that I also get a lot of is people say, well, what's going to cause the next major correction? And my answer is it'll be something that we don't see coming.
Sure.
That's
It's
always true.
If we knew it was coming, it would be priced into the market. Yes,
Exactly.
yes.
And so, I mean, what, in 2015, we had 2 corrections, and if I'm correct, that's the first time in 1 year, first time in U.S. history that we've had 2 official corrections in 1 calendar year. Is that right?
Yeah. I don't, quite frankly don't know, but when I look at and you're absolutely right, that usually it's something unexpected. For example, the housing crash that led us into the Great Recession. Unfortunately, this is, I think, really has tainted the reputation of economists because most of us missed that totally. We thought, like Alan Greenspan, who was chair of the Federal Reserve, that we've never had a major housing crash nationwide, so it's not going to happen, but it did. So that's one that people keep asking me. I think they're very sensitive to this now, the housing market, and we've seen very good upswings in housing prices, and I have people ask me all the time, are we setting ourselves up for another crash? I don't think so. So I don't think it's come from there. I think I would worry about I do have some concern that the stock market has gone up so fast and so far that that does lead to a potential for a correction. Not a 50% drop like we saw during the Great Recession, but some pullback, so I would be cautious
the
there.
problem
Some
with
say
that-
student
Yeah.
loans, there's a bubble there. I mean, we've gone from $500 billion in student loans to $1.3 trillion in the course of a decade. I think that's an issue. And then, of course, always internationally. We could have
Right.
some blow up internationally, Middle East, who knows where, North Korea,
China.
that would scare people
Right.
and cause there to be a correction.
Yeah.
Well, North Korea certainly scares me at this
Yeah.
point in terms of what they're doing.
Well, there's a lot.
But
yeah.
when we come back, and I know we have to take a break, I really want to hear what folks should be doing in terms of recognizing that tax rates may go down, but our deductions and exemptions might be lost.
Yeah, we'll be right back. and we're back.
Well, Mike, I really am interested in what folks should do now in anticipation of lower tax rates for the most part and fewer deductions, because we know that Congress doesn't like to spend less money. So if they reduce tax rates, they've got to make up for it somewhere. And most folks that believe that's going to be in reduced deductions for folks.
Yeah. Well, hard to say because we don't know exactly. We don't have a specific proposal from the administration. But just to give you an illustration, if, for example, and I'm not forecasting, but if, for example, the Trump proposal was take away all the ability to deduct home mortgage interest, take that all away. Obviously, that would affect the housing market adversely. That might change the calculus for some people as whether they buy or rent. I don't think that's going to happen. And what I think may happen, though, is some ceiling on how much in total you can deduct. I've heard, for example, for people at the very top of the bracket scale, maybe $200,000 of deductions will be it. So there won't be any specificity of what you can deduct, but your total amount you can deduct will be limited. So I'd be paying attention to that. Obviously, lower rates in general, people find that appealing, but that might affect certain investments. We've already talked about municipal bonds. I was talking to a group on Saturday, a group of government people. They were worried about low-income housing bonds, how will changes affect that? And obviously, again, anything that carries a tax benefit, the benefit of that's going to go down if tax rates are lower. So those would be the things I'd think about right now.
Well, I would think that just on the basis of if next year our tax rates are lower and our deductions might go away, or many of those deductions might go away, it would seem to me that this year would be a year to push as many deductions as we can into our 2017 taxes, and to push as much income as we have the ability to push into 2018, to push that income to next year when the rates might be lower, but to increase our deductions this year to the degree we have the ability to do that.
That's a very logical strategy, I agree.
But one of the things that is in the back of my mind also is there is this disconnect between reality and perception, that so many times people react to what they think is going to be the case, irrespective of what the facts are. Where do you see a disconnect potentially causing a
Is
ripple?
this that irrational exuberance you're talking about?
Yeah, irrational fear, irrational exuberance. I mean, it's
well, one thing that I hear people talk about all the time in the media is the president running the economy. The president doesn't run the economy. I mean, the federal government obviously has an impact. The president has an impact on what the federal government does. But for the most part, economic growth is going to be dictated by what individual business people, individual households, individual workers do. So I think that's one myth that I would dispel. We don't have an economy that in this case, President Trump is absolutely running. The second thing that I would say is that there are big forces that are in many cases more important than what the federal government does or any government. For example, we're an aging society. That impacts a lot of businesses. I can't think of a business that's not going to be impacted by that. The other thing is something economists are calling technological unemployment. And technology is becoming so adept at doing so many things, there's a big worry that maybe as many as half of today's occupations won't be around in mid-century because you'll have machines and technology doing that. So that's another thing that I think is going to impact the economy, which has big implications for educational system, because I think in the future, at my level, college, we're going to see a lot more people coming back who are in their 30s, maybe 40s, who have to change their careers because what they were trained for 20 years ago no longer exists. So don't forget those two things. President doesn't run the economy, and there are big forces that are going to affect us irregardless of what Congress and the president do.
So employees today have to be pretty nimble.
Employees, they have to be, and actually I've read studies that show that businesses, they of course hire on the base of a lot of characteristics, but they can perceive that someone is willing to adapt and change and maybe even go back to school to get another skill. That elevates that person in terms of getting hired. So that's something I communicate to my students, that try to indicate to a potential employer, yeah, you know this is a changing world and you're someone who likes change.
Yeah.
Well, when we come back, we'll have to talk about the money secret, what folks might do with this information.
Okay, we'll be right back.
Well, let's talk about the money secret. I think the money secret, obviously for employees, is they need to be nimble. They need to go back to school if possibly. But to help their employers, they have to be willing to change. For our investors, I think it's watch for the Trump proposals, see whether they really get through and whether they get through fast, and be cautious of the stock market, because if they don't get through, the market may go down significantly, because that's what investors are expecting. Business people and others should try to push their deductions into this year and push their income into next year, but reduce taxes. But Mike, you have been wonderful. I know you have a new book coming out.
I do.
Tell us about that.
UNC Press book. It's called North Carolina Beyond the Connected Age, Tar Heel State in 2050. It's looking at where we might be in terms of jobs, education, population, where people live, what they do in 2050. I tell people it's a no-lose book for me, because I probably won't be here in 2050, so if I'm wrong, I won't be around to hear the criticism. So this will be out in August from UNC Press.
Okay. Well, I'm Mike Tove of AIN Services.
And I'm Bill Alexander of WG Alexander and Associates.
And thank you for watching. Tune in next week for Money Secrets with Bill and Mike.